The Scottish people, or Scots, are a nation and socially defined ethnic group resident in Scotland. Historically, they emerged from an amalgamation of two groups, the Picts and Gaels, who founded the Kingdom of Scotland in the 9th century, and thought to have been ethno-linguistically Celts. Later, the neighbouring Cumbrian Britons, who also spoke a Celtic language, as well as Germanic-speaking Anglo-Saxons and Norse, were incorporated into the Scottish nation. In modern use, Scottish people, or Scots, is used to refer to anyone whose linguistic, cultural, family, ancestral or genetic origins are from within Scotland. The Latin word Scotti originally referred to the Gaels, but came to describe all inhabitants of Scotland. Though sometimes considered archaic or pejorative, the term Scotch has also been used for the Scottish people, though this usage is current primarily outside Scotland. There are people of Scottish descent in many countries other than Scotland. Emigration, influenced by factors such as the Highland and Lowland clearances, Scottish participation in the British Empire, and latterly industrial decline and unemployment, resulted in Scottish people being found throughout the world. Large populations of Scottish people settled the New World lands of North and South America, Australia and New Zealand. There is a Scottish presence at a particularly high level in Canada, which has the highest level per capita of Scots descendants in the world and second largest population of descended Scots ancestry, after the United States. They took with them their Scottish languages and culture. Scotland has seen migration and settlement of peoples at different periods in its history. The Gaels, the Picts and the Britons had respective origin myths, like most Middle Ages European peoples. Germanic peoples, such as the Anglo-Saxons, arrived beginning in the 7th century, while the Norse settled many regions of Scotland from the 8th century onwards. In the High Middle Ages, from the reign of David I of Scotland, there was some emigration from France, England and the Low Countries to Scotland. Some famous Scottish family names, including those bearing the names which became Bruce, Balliol, Murray and Stewart, came to Scotland at this time. Today Scotland is one of the countries of the United Kingdom and the majority of people living in Scotland are British citizens. Ethnic groups of Scotland. In the early Middle Ages, Scotland had several ethnic or cultural groups labelled as such in contemporary sources, namely the Picts, the Gaels, the Britons, with the Angles settling in the southeast of the country. Culturally, these peoples are grouped according to language. Most of Scotland until the 13th century spoke Celtic languages, and these included, at least initially, the Britons, as well as the Gaels and the Picts. Germanic peoples included the Angles of Northumbria, who settled in southeastern Scotland in the region between the Firth of Forth to the north and the River Tweed to the south. They also occupied the southwest of Scotland up to and including the Plain of Kyle, and their language, Old English, was the earliest form of the language which eventually became known as Scots. Later the Norse arrived in the north and west in quite significant numbers, recently discovered to have left about 30% of men in the Outer Hebrides with a distinct Norse marker in their DNA. Use of the Gaelic language spread throughout nearly the whole of Scotland by the 9th century, reaching a peak in the 11th to 13th centuries, but was never the language of the southeast of the country. After the division of Northumbria between Scotland and England by King Edgar, the Scottish kingdom encompassed a great number of English people, with larger numbers quite possibly arriving after the Norman invasion of England. Southeast of the Firth of Forth, then in Lothian and the Borders, a northern variety of Old English, also known as Early Scots, was spoken. As a result of David I, King of Scots, return from exile in England in 1113, ultimately to assume the throne in 1124 with the help of Norman military force. David invited Norman families from France and England to settle in lands he granted them to spread a ruling class loyal to him. This Davidian revolution, as many historians call it, brought a European style of feudalism to Scotland along with an influx of people of Norman descent, by invitation. Unlike England where it was by conquest. To this day, many of the common family names of Scotland can trace ancestry to Normans from this period, such as the Stuarts, the Bruces, the Hamiltons, the Wallaces, the Melvilles, some Browns and many others. The Northern Isles and some parts of Caithness were Norn-speaking. From 1200 to 1500 the early Scots language spread across the lowland parts of Scotland between Galloway and the Highland Line, being used by Barbour in his historical epic, The Bruce, in the late 14th century in Aberdeen. From 1500 until recent years, Scotland was commonly divided by language into two groups of people: Gaelic-speaking, Highlanders, and the English-speaking, Lowlanders. Today, immigrants have brought other languages, but almost every adult throughout Scotland is fluent in the English language. Scottish diaspora. Today, Scotland has a population of just over 5 million people, the majority of whom consider themselves Scottish. In addition, there are many more people with Scots ancestry living abroad than the total population of Scotland. United States. In the 2013 American Community Survey, 5,310,285 identified as Scottish and 2,976,878 Scots-Irish descent. Americans of Scottish descent outnumber the population of Scotland, where 4,459,071 or 88.09% of people identified as ethnic Scottish in the 2001 census. The number of Americans of Scottish descent today is estimated to be 20 to 25 million, and Scotch-Irish, 27 to 30 million. The subgroups overlapping and not always distinguishable because of their shared ancestral surnames. The majority of Scotch-Irish originally came from lowland Scotland and northern England before migrating to the province of Ulster in Ireland and thence, beginning about 5 generations later, to North America in large numbers during the 18th century. Canada is the third largest ethnic group in Canada and amongst the first Europeans to settle in the country. Scottish people have made a large impact on Canadian culture since colonial times. According to the 2011 Census of Canada, the number of Canadians claiming full or partial Scottish descent is 4,714,970, or 15.10% of the nation's total population. Many respondents may have misunderstood the question, and the numerous responses for Canadian does not give an accurate figure for numerous groups, particularly those of British Isles origins. Scottish Canadians are the third biggest ethnic group in Canada. Scottish culture has particularly thrived in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. There, in Cape Breton, where both Lowland and Highland Scots settled in large numbers, Canadian Gaelic is still spoken by a small number of residents. Cape Breton is the home of the Gaelic College of Celtic Arts and Crafts. Glengarry County in present-day eastern Ontario is a historic county that was set up as a settlement for Highland Scots, where many from the Highlands settled to preserve their culture in result of the Highland clearances. Gaelic was the native language of the community since its settlement in the 18th century, although the number of speakers decreased since as a result of English migration. As of the modern 21st century, there are still a few Gaelic speakers in the community. Australia. By 1830, 15.11% of the colony's total population were Scots, which increased by the middle of the century to 25,000, or 20 to 25% of the total population. The Australian gold rush of the 1850s provided a further impetus for Scottish migration. In the 1850s, 90,000 Scots immigrated, far higher than other British or Irish populations at the time. Literacy rates of the Scottish immigrants ran at 90 to 95%. By 1860, Scots made up 50% of the ethnic composition of Western Victoria, Adelaide, Penola, and Naracoorte. Other settlements in New South Wales included New England, the Hunter Valley and the Illawarra. Much settlement followed the Highland potato famine, highland clearances and the lowland clearances of the mid-19th century. In the 1840s, Scots-born immigrants constituted 12% of the Australian population. Out of the 1.3 million migrants from Britain to Australia in the period from 1861 to 1914, 13.5% were Scots. Just 5.3% of the convicts transported to Eastern Australia between 1789 and 1852 were Scots. A steady rate of Scottish immigration continued into the 20th century, with substantial numbers of Scots continued to arrive after 1945. From 1900 until the 1950s, Scots favoured New South Wales, as well as Western Australia and Southern Australia. A strong cultural Scottish presence is evident in the Highland Games, dance, tartan day celebrations, clan and Gaelic-speaking societies found throughout modern Australia. According to the 2011 Australian census, 130,204 Australian residents were born in Scotland, while 1,792,600 claimed Scottish ancestry, either alone or in combination with another ancestry. This is the fourth most commonly nominated ancestry and represents over 8.9% of the total population of Australia. New Zealand. Significant numbers of Scottish people also settled in New Zealand. Approximately 20% of the original European settler population of New Zealand came from Scotland, and Scottish influence is still visible around the country. The South Island city of Dunedin, in particular, is known for its Scottish heritage and was named as a tribute to Edinburgh by the city's Scottish founders. In Australia, the Scottish population was fairly evenly distributed around the country. Scottish migration to New Zealand dates back to the earliest period of European colonisation, with a large proportion of Pākehā New Zealanders being of Scottish descent. However, identification as British or European New Zealanders can sometimes obscure their origin. Many Scottish New Zealanders also have Maori or other non-European ancestry. The majority of Scottish immigrants settled in the South Island. All over New Zealand, the Scots developed different means to bridge the old homeland and the new. Many Caledonian societies were formed, well over 100 by the early 20th century, who helped maintain Scottish culture and traditions. From the 1860s, these societies organised annual Caledonian Games throughout New Zealand. The Games were sports meets that brought together Scottish settlers and the wider New Zealand public. In so doing, the Games gave Scots a path to cultural integration as Scottish New Zealanders. United Kingdom. Large numbers of Scottish people reside in other parts of the United Kingdom and in the Republic of Ireland, particularly Ulster, where they form the Ulster Scots community. The number of people of Scottish descent in England and Wales is impossible to quantify due to the ancient and complex pattern of migration within Great Britain. Of the present generation alone, some 800,000 people born in Scotland now reside in either England, Wales or Northern Ireland. Rest of Europe. Other European countries have had their share of Scots immigrants. The Scots have been emigrating to mainland Europe for centuries as merchants and soldiers. Many emigrated to France, Poland, Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, and the Netherlands. Recently, some scholars suggested that up to 250,000 Russians may have Scottish ancestry. Africa. A number of Scottish people settled in South Africa in the 1800s and were known for their road-building expertise, their farming experience, and architectural skills. Latin America. The largest population of Scots in Latin America is found in Argentina, followed by Chile, Brazil and Mexico. Scots in continental Europe. Netherlands. It is said that the first people from the Low Countries to settle in Scotland came in the wake of Maud's marriage to the Scottish king, David I, during the Middle Ages. Craftsmen and tradesmen followed courtiers, and in later centuries a brisk trade grew up between the two nations. Scotland's primary goods in exchange for the luxuries obtainable in the Netherlands, one of the major hubs of European trade. By 1600, trading colonies had grown up on either side of the well-travelled shipping routes, the Dutch settling along the eastern seaboard of Scotland, the Scots congregating first in Campville, where they were allowed to land their goods duty-free and run their own affairs, and then Rotterdam, where Scottish and Dutch Calvinism coexisted comfortably. Besides the thousands of local descendants with Scots ancestry, both ports still show signs of these early alliances. Now a museum, the Scots House, in the town of Ayr was the only place out with Scotland where Scots law was practiced. In Rotterdam, meanwhile, the doors of the Scots International Church have remained open ever since 1643. Russia. The first Scots to be mentioned in Russia's history were the Scottish soldiers in Muscovy, referred to as early as in the 14th century. Among the soldiers of fortune was the ancestor to famous Russian poet Mikhail Lermontov, called George Lermontov. A number of Scots gained wealth and fame in the times of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. These include Patrick Gordon, Samuel Greig, Charles Baird, Charles Cameron, Adam Menelaus, William Hasty. Several doctors to the Russian court were from Scotland, the best known being James Wiley. The next wave of migration established commercial links with Russia. The 19th century witnessed the immense literary cross-references between Scotland and Russia. A Russian scholar, Maria Koroleva, distinguishes between the Russian Scots and Scots in Russia, who remained thoroughly Scottish. There are several societies in contemporary Russia to unite the Scots. The Russian census lists does not distinguish Scots from other British people, so it is hard to establish reliable figures for the number of Scots living and working in modern Russia. Poland. From as far back as the mid-16th century there were Scots trading and settling in Poland. A Scotch peddler's pack in Poland became a proverbial expression. It usually consisted of cloths, woolen goods and linen kerchiefs. Itinerants also sold tin utensils and ironware such as scissors and knives. Along with the protection offered by King Stephen in the royal grant of 1576, a district in Krakow was assigned to Scots immigrants. Records from 1592 reveal Scots settlers, giving their employment his trader or merchant, being granted citizenship of Krakow. Payment for being granted citizenship ranged from 12 Polish florins to a musket and gunpowder, or an undertaking to marry within a year and a day of acquiring a holding. By the 17th century, there were an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 Scots living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Many came from Dundee and Aberdeen and could be found in Polish towns on the banks of the Vistula as far south as Krakow. Settlers from Aberdeenshire were mainly Episcopalians or Catholics, but there were also large numbers of Calvinists. As well as Scottish traders, there were also many Scottish soldiers in Poland. In 1656, a number of Scottish Highlanders who were disenchanted with Oliver Cromwell's rule went to Poland in the service of the King of Sweden. The Scots integrated well and many acquired great wealth. They contributed to many charitable institutions in the host country, but did not forget their homeland. For example, in 1701 when collections were made for the Restoration Fund of the Marischal College, Aberdeen, the Scottish settlers in Poland gave generously. Many royal grants and privileges were granted to Scottish merchants until the 18th century, at which time the settlers began to merge more and more into the native population. Bonnie Prince Charlie was half Polish, being the son of James Stewart, the Old Pretender, and Klementyna Sobieska, granddaughter of Jan Sobieski, King of Poland. In 1691, the city of Warsaw elected the Scottish immigrant Alexander Zama as its mayor. Italy. By 1592, the Scottish community in Rome was big enough to merit the building of Sant'Andrea degli Scozzesi. It was constructed for the Scottish expatriate community in Rome, especially for those intended for priesthood. The adjoining hospice was a shelter for Catholic Scots who fled their country because of religious persecution. In 1615, Pope Paul V gave the hospice and the nearby Scottish seminar to the Jesuits. It was rebuilt in 1645. The church and facilities became more important when James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, set to his residence in Rome in 1717. But were abandoned during the French occupation of Rome in the late 18th century. In 1820, although religious activity was resumed, it was no longer led by the Jesuits. Sant'Andrea degli Scozzesi was reconstructed in 1869 by Luigi Poletti. The church was deconsecrated in 1962 and incorporated into a bank. The Scottish seminar also moved away. The Feast of St. Andrew is still celebrated there on the 30th of November. Gurrow in Italy is said to be populated by the descendants of Scottish soldiers. According to local legend, Scottish soldiers fleeing the Battle of Pavia who arrived in the area were stopped by severe blizzards that forced many, if not all, to give up to their travels and settle in the town. To this day, the town of Gurrow is still proud of its Scottish links. Many of the residents claim that their surnames are Italian translations of Scottish surnames. The town also has a Scottish museum.